Black CEO thrown out of a yacht party by Hostess. Panic erupts when he finally speaks. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, back to our main character. Marcus Ellison stood at the edge of the dock as the last sliver of sunset folded into the water, the harbor glowing in shades of gold and steel. A 70-foot luxury yacht idling quietly a few yards away as laughter drifted across the deck, like background music meant for someone else. He had arrived alone, dressed simply in a navy blazer over a plain white shirt, tailored slacks, no visible logos, no entourage, nothing that announced power to people who only recognized it when it sparkled. The invitation on his phone was real, forwarded twice through private channels, the kind that didn't need a paper trail. But before Marcus could step onto the polished gangway, a woman in an elegant black dress moved into his path with a practiced smile that never reached her eyes. Her name was Charlotte Whitmore, the hostess tasked with guarding the invisible line between those who belonged and those who didn't, and she barely glanced at his face before her eyes dropped to his shoes, then flicked back up with a subtle tightening at the corners. She asked for his name, then paused just long enough for the pause itself to become an accusation, finally shaking her head as if the list in her mind had already made its decision. "This is a private event," she said smoothly, her voice light but firm, "and I don't see you on the confirmed guest roster." Marcus replied calmly that he was invited, that there must be a mistake, but Charlotte stepped half a pace closer, angling her body to block the ramp, lowering her tone as if offering help while delivering judgment. "Tonight is very exclusive," she added, suggesting he check with whoever sent him, because access was limited and space was tight. Around them, conversation softened, then slowed, a few guests turning just enough to watch without appearing to stare, champagne glasses hovering midair as curiosity spread. Marcus felt the familiar weight settle in his chest, not anger, not surprise, but recognition, the quiet understanding of a moment he had lived variations of for years. Moments where the rules changed without warning and the door closed with a smile. Charlotte's expression hardened when he didn't move, and she gestured subtly toward a security guard farther down the dock, a signal so small it could be denied later, if needed. "I'm going to have to ask you to step away from the yacht," she said, still polite, still composed, but now loud enough for others to hear, the words landing with the finality of a verdict. Marcus looked past her at the deck, at the guests who had already decided this wasn't their problem, at the city skyline rising in the distance like a reminder of everything he had built and everything this moment tried to erase. He said nothing. He didn't argue, didn't explain, didn't raise his voice. He simply stood there, hands relaxed at his sides, eyes steady, letting the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable, until it pressed against Charlotte's certainty and the crowd's assumptions. The yacht's engines hummed softly, the water lapped against the hull, and in that narrow space between the dock and the deck, a decision had already been made about who Marcus Ellison was allowed to be. And for the first time since he arrived, Charlotte felt it too, that faint shift in the air, the sense that this interaction was not ending the way she expected, that the man she had just dismissed carried something she hadn't accounted for, something that hadn't spoken yet, but soon would. Marcus Ellison did not step back when Charlotte Whitmore finished speaking, and he did not step forward either, because he understood something she did not. That movement in moments like this was interpreted as weakness, and stillness unsettled people who believed they controlled the room. The dock beneath his shoes was warm from the day's sun, the scent of salt and fuel lingering in the air, and the yacht loomed beside him like a floating declaration of who was allowed to be seen and who was meant to disappear quietly. Charlotte adjusted her posture, shoulders squared, chin lifted, performing confidence for the small audience that had formed. And she repeated herself with a softer smile, suggesting again that he wait on shore while she verified the guest list, as if verification was a courtesy rather than a test he had already failed in her mind. Marcus listened without interrupting, his gaze drifting past her to the deck where a group of men laughed over glasses of amber liquid. one of them glancing down at Marcus with curiosity before quickly looking away, uninterested in the outcome as long as the inconvenience did not touch him. The security guard Charlotte had signaled earlier began walking closer at an unhurried pace, not aggressive, just present, his presence itself a message, and Marcus noticed how Charlotte's tone changed with each step the guard took, growing firmer, more official, as though authority arrived externally and could be borrowed when needed. She explained policies that did not exist in writing, referenced standards that shifted without notice, and framed exclusion as organization, all while maintaining the polite cadence of someone who would later insist she had been nothing but professional. Marcus remained silent, and in that silence his thoughts moved inward, recalling boardrooms where men twice as loud said half as much, charity galas where his donation was accepted before his name was recognized, meetings where assistants assumed he was there to deliver something rather than decide something. None of those memories carried bitterness now, only clarity, the understanding that patterns repeated because people relied on them working. Charlotte glanced at her phone, pretending to check something, then looked back up with a faint sigh, the kind meant to signal inconvenience rather than resolution, and she told Marcus that unfortunately his name still was not appearing, that mistakes happened, but tonight was not the night to resolve them. Around them, the dock felt smaller, the air tighter, as if the moment had drawn a boundary invisible but firm, and Marcus sensed the quiet expectation that he would comply, that he would apologize for the trouble, that he would remove himself and make this easier for everyone else. Instead, he shifted his weight slightly and looked Charlotte directly in the eyes for the first time, not with challenge, not with pleading, but with calm attention, as though he were listening carefully to someone who would soon need to listen just as closely. Charlotte faltered for half a second, recovering quickly, but the pause did not go unnoticed by the guests nearest the railing, one woman tilting her head, another whispering something under her breath. The security guard stopped a few feet away, waiting for instruction, and Charlotte nodded subtly toward Marcus, a final prompt, her patience thinning now that compliance had not come on cue. Marcus said nothing still, because he knew that the moment was ripening, that the assumptions stacked around him required time to harden before they could crack, and as the yacht rocked gently against its moorings and the city lights flickered on across the water, the power in the space began to shift, not outwardly, not yet, but enough for Charlotte to feel it, enough for unease to creep into the edges of her practiced smile, enough for everyone watching to sense that this situation was no longer under her control. Charlotte Whitmore exhaled slowly, the sound barely audible beneath the hum of the yacht, and she shifted tactics the way people did when certainty began to slip, leaning not on authority now, but on suggestion, on the polished language of inclusion that still excluded all the same. She explained again that the event was curated, that sponsors expected a certain atmosphere, that she had a responsibility to protect the experience for the guests already aboard, and each phrase was delivered gently, almost kindly, as if she were doing Marcus Ellison a favor by denying him entry. Marcus listened, his face unreadable, his posture unchanged, and he noticed how her words circled around the same unspoken idea, that he disrupted the picture, that his presence asked questions no one here wanted to answer. A breeze rolled off the water, fluttering the edge of Charlotte's dress, and she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, glancing briefly toward the deck, as if seeking reassurance from the crowd that had begun to pay closer attention. A man near the rail whispered something to his companion. A woman with a jeweled clutch frowned faintly, and somewhere behind Marcus a couple slowed their walk, pretending to admire the marina while listening closely. The security guard cleared his throat softly, still waiting, and Charlotte nodded again, her patience thinning as the situation refused to resolve itself cleanly. She suggested that Marcus could enjoy the nearby waterfront bar, that perhaps the person who invited him had made an honest mistake, that these things happened more often than people realized, and Marcus recognized the familiar maneuver, the attempt to reframe rejection as inconvenience rather than decision. He thought of the hours he had spent in rooms where access was the currency, where invitations were leverage, where a single introduction could open doors that money alone never touched, and he understood exactly what this party represented, not celebration but alignment, not leisure but quiet negotiation under the guise of leisure. Charlotte's smile tightened when Marcus still did not move, and for the first time irritation crept into her voice, not loud, not sharp, but unmistakable, as she reminded him that the yacht would be departing shortly and that she needed to clear the dock. The implications settled heavily in the air, that his presence was now a problem to be removed. Marcus finally glanced down at his phone, not to check messages, but to note the time, the digital clock glowing softly in the gathering dusk, and Charlotte misread the gesture instantly, straightening as if she had caught him in something. "If you are waiting on confirmation," she said quickly, "you will need to do that off the dock." Marcus looked up again, meeting her gaze, and there was no anger there, only a quiet steadiness that made her pause despite herself. Around them, the yacht's crew moved with practiced efficiency, lines being checked, glasses refilled, music lowered just enough to sharpen the tension, and the party hovered on the edge of something unnamed. Charlotte took a small step back, creating distance, her confidence no longer seamless, and she gestured once more toward the shore, this time less gracefully, the motion betraying her need to regain control. Marcus remained where he was, because he knew that this moment was no longer about entry. It was about exposure, about how far the assumptions would be allowed to stretch before they snapped. And as the dock lights flickered on and reflected across the water, casting long shadows that blurred the boundary between land and sea, the audience around them sensed it too. The shift from inconvenience to reckoning. The quiet realization that whatever came next would not be handled with a smile. The dock no longer felt like a passageway, but like a stage, the kind no one agreed to, but everyone recognized once the lights shifted, and the guests aboard the yacht had begun to notice that the quiet standoff was not resolving itself the way these situations usually did. Conversations resumed in fragments, laughter sounded forced, and several people found reasons to drift closer to the railing, curiosity overcoming etiquette inch by inch. Marcus Ellison sensed their attention without turning, the subtle weight of eyes measuring him, reassessing him, wondering what kind of man did not rush to explain himself when offered an exit wrapped in politeness. A woman in a pale blazer leaned toward her companion and whispered that something about this felt wrong, while a man with a watch that caught the deck lights frowned openly, his gaze flicking between Charlotte Whitmore and Marcus, as if trying to identify the misstep. Charlotte felt it too, the slow erosion of the certainty she had relied on, and she straightened again, projecting calm, projecting control, her voice carrying just enough to signal that she was handling the situation. She explained once more that she was simply following procedure, that access was limited, that she hoped everyone understood, and the words were aimed less at Marcus now and more at the audience gathering behind her. The security guard shifted his stance, not moving closer, not retreating, and his hesitation spoke louder than any order could have, because hesitation suggested doubt, and doubt spread quickly in spaces built on appearances. Marcus remained still, his calm no longer invisible but conspicuous, and that calm unsettled the rhythm of the event more than any raised voice would have. One guest cleared his throat and murmured that the man did not seem disruptive. Another nodded slightly, then caught herself and looked away, unwilling to be the first to cross an invisible line. Phones appeared in hands, not raised, not recording openly, but present, the quiet insurance people carried when they sensed history might bend. Charlotte noticed and felt a flicker of irritation sharpen into something closer to concern, because witnesses changed outcomes, and she was no longer sure how many she had. She adjusted her tone again, this time firmer, reminding Marcus that the yacht was preparing to depart, that lingering on the dock was not permitted, and the phrasing was deliberate, a shift from suggestion to instruction. Marcus heard it and understood that the line had been moved once more, the ground narrowing beneath him by design, and he wondered how many of the people watching recognized the pattern, how many had seen it before in different places with different faces. A woman near the bar on deck set her glass down untouched, her smile fading as she studied Marcus more closely, while a younger man whispered that this was uncomfortable, that someone should check the list again. Charlotte waved that off with a small laugh that did not convince even her, insisting she already had, insisting there was no issue, even as the issue stood quietly in front of her refusing to disappear. The music resumed a fraction louder, an attempt to smooth over the tension, but it only underscored the unease, the sense that the party had stalled on something unresolved. Marcus felt the moment thicken, the air charged not with confrontation but with anticipation, the kind that preceded truth rather than conflict. He knew the crowd was beginning to divide, not into sides but into questions, and questions were dangerous to systems that relied on silence. Charlotte glanced once more at the security guard, then back at Marcus, her confidence no longer seamless, and for the first time she hesitated before speaking again. The dock lights reflected off the water in broken lines, and in those reflections the watchers saw themselves, their complicity, their curiosity, their choice to stay or look away, as the quiet tension stretched just a little further, waiting for the moment when observation would no longer be enough. Marcus Ellison felt the weight of the moment press inward, and with it came a memory he did not invite but recognized immediately, the kind that surfaced when the present aligned too closely with the past. He remembered standing in a glass lobby years earlier, polished marble floors and a receptionist who smiled too quickly, too brightly, asking him to wait, while others arrived after him and were ushered through without pause. He remembered the way time slowed in places like that, how minutes stretched until they felt like judgment, how silence became a test of worth rather than patience. On the dock, the water shifted gently against the hull, but inside Marcus the memory sharpened, not with pain but with clarity, reminding him how often exclusion wore the costume of order. He recalled a charity gala early in his career, invited as a donor but mistaken for staff, handed a tray he did not ask for, the embarrassment disguised as politeness when the error was corrected and never truly apologized for. The faces blurred together now, different years, different cities, same posture, same assumptions, and Marcus understood that what stood in front of him was not just Charlotte Whitmore, but a familiar structure repeating itself because it expected him to shrink. The dock lights reflected off the water, and for a moment the reflection resembled the ceiling lights of a conference room he once entered where introductions stopped mid-sentence when he took his seat, the brief recalibration as people adjusted their expectations in real time. He had learned then, as he learned now, that explaining himself too early only reinforced the imbalance, that power revealed under pressure carried more weight than power announced at the door. Charlotte's voice drifted toward him again, still speaking, still managing the narrative, and her words overlapped with the memory of a banker who had asked twice for verification, not because it was required but because doubt needed a reason to exist. Marcus stayed present, his attention split between the dock and the past, between the hostess in front of him and the younger version of himself who had once wondered if patience would ever be enough. He knew now that patience was not submission, that it was strategy shaped by experience, and he felt a steadiness settle over him that had nothing to do with the crowd watching and everything to do with knowing exactly who he was. Around him, the murmurs continued, the witnesses shifting, the curiosity deepening, and Marcus realized that the memory was not weakening him but anchoring him, reminding him that this moment fit into a longer story that did not end here. He saw again the office where he had signed his first major deal, the pen heavy in his hand, the silence thick with disbelief until numbers replaced doubt and respect followed reluctantly behind. Those rooms had taught him that the truth did not need to rush, that it arrived when the conditions were set, and as he stood on the dock, the conditions were quietly aligning. Charlotte hesitated mid-sentence, sensing something she could not name, and Marcus returned fully to the present, the memory receding but its lesson intact. The dock, the yacht, the guests, all of it sharpened into focus, and he understood that what he was waiting for was not permission but readiness, not for himself but for everyone else. The past had shown him how these moments ended when handled with restraint, and as the water lapped softly below and the lights cast steady reflections across the marina, Marcus Ellison remained still, not because he was unsure, but because he knew exactly when silence stopped being absence and became warning. Charlotte Whitmore made the decision quietly, the way people did when they believed escalation would force compliance, and she straightened her shoulders as if preparing to close a matter that had lingered too long. She informed Marcus Ellison that the yacht was on a departure schedule and that anyone not cleared to board needed to vacate the dock immediately, her voice firm now, stripped of the softness she had used earlier. The word immediately hung in the air, not shouted, not dramatic, but unmistakable in its intent, and several guests shifted uncomfortably as they heard it. The security guard took a single step closer, still professional, still restrained, but now clearly part of the exchange, and Charlotte nodded once. A subtle confirmation that she expected this to end without further delay. Marcus registered the movement without reacting, his calm now contrasting sharply with the urgency Charlotte was projecting, and that contrast drew more attention than any argument could have. A man near the rail frowned openly and murmured that this seemed unnecessary, while another guest checked his phone, the glow lighting his face as he glanced between the screen and the dock. Charlotte addressed Marcus again, stating that refusal to leave would create complications, and the phrasing was careful, framed as concern rather than threat, but the implication was clear enough for everyone listening. Marcus felt the moment reach its narrowest point, the space where silence either collapsed into retreat or transformed into something else entirely. He understood that Charlotte believed she was applying pressure, that she thought urgency would expose him, but what she did not see was how that pressure was beginning to work against her, drawing a sharper outline around her assumptions. The security guard hesitated, glancing briefly toward the yacht, then back to Charlotte, waiting for a clearer directive, and that hesitation did not go unnoticed by the crowd. A woman near the entrance to the deck shook her head slightly, whispering that this had gone too far, while another guest folded his arms, watching with open interest now rather than detached curiosity. Charlotte noticed the shifting mood and pressed forward, repeating that the event was private, that the guest list was final, that she was responsible for maintaining order, and each repetition sounded less like authority and more like insistence. Marcus remained where he was, his gaze steady, his breathing slow, and for the first time Charlotte's confidence wavered visibly, her eyes flicking again to the phones in people's hands, to the security guard who had not yet acted, to the yacht crew who had paused their preparations to watch. The dock felt suspended between two outcomes, and Marcus sensed that the final push had arrived, not for him, but for the situation itself. Charlotte took a half step closer than before, lowering her voice as if proximity could resolve what command had not, and told him this was his last opportunity to leave quietly. The word quietly carried weight, suggesting that noise would follow if he did not comply, and the guests felt it, the collective intake of breath as the choice was framed. Marcus looked at Charlotte, then at the security guard, then briefly at the yacht behind them, and the sequence was deliberate, measured, as if he were acknowledging each piece of the system arrayed in front of him. He still did not speak, and that silence, stretched to its limit, began to feel less like absence and more like restraint, the kind that precedes a decisive shift. Charlotte swallowed, her composure thinning, and for the first time she wondered if she had misjudged not just the man in front of her, but the moment itself. The dock lights hummed softly overhead, the water reflecting their glow in steady ripples, and as the seconds passed without Marcus moving or responding, it became clear to everyone watching that whatever was about to happen next would not be controlled by urgency or pressure, but by something far more deliberate. Marcus Ellison finally spoke, and the sound of his voice did not rise above the hum of the dock lights or the low murmur of the yacht's engines, but it cut through the moment with a precision that immediately changed the air. He did not address Charlotte Whitmore with anger or accusation, and he did not explain himself, because explanation was not what this moment required. He simply asked, calmly and clearly, whether she was prepared to take responsibility for denying entry to a guest whose presence had been approved by the vessel's owner and underwritten by the event's primary backer. The question landed softly, almost politely, but it carried weight, and for a brief second no one reacted at all, as if the dock itself had paused to register the words. Charlotte blinked, her expression flickering between confusion and disbelief, and she let out a short, dismissive laugh that came a fraction too late, insisting that there must be some misunderstanding. Marcus did not respond to the deflection. He followed the question with a statement, delivered in the same even tone, noting that the decision she had just enforced would be reviewed in real time by people who valued accuracy over assumption. The security guard stiffened slightly, not stepping back, but no longer advancing, his attention sharpening as he sensed the shift. Guests who had been watching casually now leaned in openly, phones no longer hidden at their sides, but held loosely in hands, curiosity turning into alertness. Charlotte's smile tightened, and she asked Marcus who exactly he thought he was speaking for, her voice betraying the first hint of strain as she tried to regain footing. Marcus met her gaze steadily and replied that he was speaking for himself, and that in this instance, that was sufficient. The simplicity of the response unsettled her more than any raised voice could have, because it did not invite argument or negotiation. A man on the yacht muttered under his breath that something was off, and a woman near the rail frowned, her earlier detachment replaced by concern. Charlotte glanced quickly toward the yacht, scanning faces as if seeking confirmation that this was still under control, but the looks she received were no longer aligned with her certainty. Marcus continued, stating that the delay had been noted, the witnesses had been noted, and the manner in which the situation had been handled would be addressed without further discussion on the dock. He did not name names or titles, but the implication threaded through the space, and it was enough. Charlotte's posture shifted almost imperceptibly, her shoulders drawing in as she processed what she was hearing, and for the first time she hesitated before speaking. She asked, more sharply now, what he meant by addressed, and Marcus replied that she would find out shortly, because the people who needed to be informed already were. The dock felt suddenly smaller, the luxury of the setting unable to mask the tension that spread as realization dawned. Guests exchanged glances, whispers rippling outward as the idea took shape that this was no longer a simple refusal at a party. Charlotte's confidence fractured visibly, her gaze darting to the security guard, to the yacht crew, to the phones now clearly pointed in her direction, and panic flickered at the edges of her composure. Marcus fell silent again, having said exactly what he intended to say, and that silence now carried authority rather than restraint. The water continued to lap gently against the hull. The music aboard the yacht faltered, and in the charged quiet that followed, it became clear to everyone present that the balance of power had shifted decisively, not through confrontation, but through a few measured words that could not be taken back. The reaction was not immediate chaos, but something more telling, a ripple of unease that moved through the dock and onto the yacht as people began to reassess what they were witnessing in real time. Charlotte Whitmore's breath shortened as she glanced again at Marcus Ellison, then quickly away, as if eye contact itself had become risky, and she reached instinctively for her phone, checking it with a speed that betrayed urgency rather than routine. The security guard shifted his weight back this time, creating space instead of closing it, his earlier certainty replaced by caution, and that single movement did more to alter the mood than any announcement could have. On deck, conversation stopped outright. Glasses were set down untouched, and the music that had attempted to smooth the tension was turned off completely, leaving only the quiet sounds of water and distant city traffic. A guest near the rail whispered that they recognized Marcus, not fully, not by name, but by reputation, by the way certain people moved through rooms without needing permission, and the whisper spread, fragment by fragment, until curiosity turned into alarm. Charlotte's phone vibrated once, then again, and she stared at the screen longer than necessary before looking up, her composure thinning as questions began to surface around her. Someone asked quietly whether there had been a mistake. Another wondered aloud why this was being handled on the dock instead of resolved privately, and Charlotte attempted to respond with a light laugh that failed to convince even herself. She assured them she was clarifying things, that it was a simple mix-up, but the word simple sounded hollow now, stripped of its earlier authority. Marcus remained silent, watching the system he had named begin to expose itself, the quickened movements, the forced smiles, the subtle retreat of confidence from the person who had so readily wielded it moments earlier. A yacht crew member approached Charlotte hesitantly, speaking in a low voice, and she stiffened, nodding too quickly, her eyes darting back to Marcus as if measuring the distance between assumption and consequence. Guests began pulling out their phones more openly now, not to record drama, but to confirm information, to search names, to text contacts who might know more than they did, and the dock filled with the quiet hum of verification. A man near the entrance to the deck muttered that this was not how things usually went, and a woman beside him replied that maybe that was the point. Charlotte's voice wavered as she spoke again, this time not to Marcus but to the group around her, suggesting they step back aboard while she resolved an administrative issue, and the phrasing was careful, almost pleading, the posture of someone trying to contain fallout rather than manage entry. Marcus watched her carefully, noting how quickly the authority she had projected dissolved once it was questioned, and he understood that panic rarely announced itself loudly. It revealed itself in hurried corrections and shifting explanations. The security guard received a call and stepped aside to answer it, his expression changing as he listened, and when he returned, he no longer looked to Charlotte for instruction. The realization hit the group almost simultaneously, a shared awareness that the balance had tipped, that whatever power Charlotte believed she held had been conditional and temporary. Whispers turned into murmurs, murmurs into low conversations, and the yacht felt less like a private celebration and more like a room where accountability had entered quietly and refused to leave. Marcus stayed where he was, calm and unmoved, because he knew the panic unfolding around him was not directed at him at all. It was directed inward, at the assumptions that had led everyone here. And as the marina lights reflected across the water in steady lines, the truth settled in among the guests and staff alike that this moment would not be smoothed over, that it would be remembered not for its spectacle, but for the way certainty collapsed when it met reality. The dock settled into a quiet that felt earned rather than imposed, and Marcus Ellison sensed that the moment had reached its natural conclusion without needing further words. Charlotte Whitmore stood a few steps away now, her phone lowered, her posture smaller, the certainty she had worn earlier replaced by the careful stillness of someone aware she was being observed differently. The guests aboard the yacht no longer pretended this was a minor inconvenience, their conversations shifting toward reflection, toward the uncomfortable recognition of how easily assumptions had guided behavior. Marcus did not press the moment, did not catalog grievances or demand explanations, because he understood that the most lasting statements were often made without spectacle. He took a slow step back from the ramp, not retreating but repositioning himself, signaling that the dock no longer defined the terms of his presence. A crew member approached quietly and spoke to Charlotte again, and this time she listened without interruption, nodding as if absorbing instructions rather than issuing them. The security guard stood at ease, hands relaxed, his attention now evenly distributed, and the subtle change in his stance mirrored the broader shift that had taken place. Marcus looked out across the marina, the lights reflecting in steady lines across the water, and felt the familiar calm that followed clarity, the knowledge that he had not compromised himself to be understood. He addressed Charlotte once more, his voice measured and composed, stating simply that moments like this mattered not because they were dramatic, but because they revealed standards, and standards, once exposed, demanded accountability. He did not raise his voice, did not linger on blame, and the restraint itself carried more weight than confrontation ever could. Charlotte nodded, her response quiet, almost reflexive, and for the first time since the exchange began, she did not attempt to control the narrative. Guests nearby listened closely, some with relief, others with discomfort, but all aware that something fundamental had been articulated. Marcus turned slightly, acknowledging the witnesses without performing for them, his presence steady, unhurried, and as he did, several people lowered their phones, the impulse to document replaced by the instinct to remember. The yacht remained docked longer than planned, its departure delayed not by logistics, but by reflection, and the party atmosphere did not resume, not because it was forbidden, but because it no longer felt appropriate. Marcus took another step away from the ramp, giving the space back to those who needed to process what had occurred, and the gesture was deliberate, an assertion that dignity did not require domination. As he walked along the dock, the night air cool against his face, he felt no triumph, only resolution, the quiet satisfaction of knowing he had neither absorbed nor returned the disrespect he had been offered. Behind him, conversations softened, voices lowered, and Charlotte remained where she was, the lesson settling in not through reprimand but through awareness. Marcus paused briefly at the end of the dock and looked back once, not to check the outcome, but to mark the moment, to ensure it was complete. Then he continued on, leaving behind a gathering that would remember him not for how loudly he spoke, but for how decisively he set a boundary, a reminder that power did not announce itself with noise. It revealed itself through composure, and that true authority was never about forcing entry, but about redefining who was allowed to decide who belonged.